The views expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect those of this station.
Welcome to Insights into Northeast Michigan, a WBKB News public affairs program. Insights deals with the issues affecting those in the community, as well as Northeast Michigan and the state. And now, Insights into Northeast Michigan.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Insights. I'm Aaron Parsegian and I'm joined this morning by ACC Professor of Political Science, Tim Kuhnlein. Tim, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
And so we're going to get right into it. Nationally speaking, Election Day was a couple weeks ago. The pundits weren't expecting this, polls weren't expecting this. Donald Trump came out the victor. Is that something you saw coming?
No, although I had a bet a while ago that he could potentially win this thing, and no one really believed it, but I won the bet. So, yeah, that was a real shocker, I think, for everyone, including the campaign. But I think it's an indication of where we are. When you think about the polls, and they're going to assess the science behind that, but obviously this is a very close election, one of the closest in history. I mean, we're talking about 0.1%. Not only in the national popular election, but within those states that ultimately determined the Electoral College outcome, we're talking razor thin, I mean, not in every instance, from Pennsylvania to Michigan to Wisconsin, they're razor thin margins of victory, less than 0.1%.
And they're always saying, the presidential candidate, it's hard to win unless you win these battleground states like Florida, Ohio. And as the numbers were coming in, it was Trump wins Florida, Trump wins Ohio, and that's not many people expected to win both, let alone one.
Or all three.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, most of the attention was on Florida and North Carolina, but clearly that, I think it's just a sign of where we are. There are a lot of people really struggling. We can talk about the social issues of our society and people feeling that their day is due, for equal rights and whatnot, but at the same time, I think people are also struggling with their economic situation. And it's no surprise, we have the largest discrepancies of wealth in the history of our country right now. And Donald Trump was able to tap into that. And he did it in a way that I think most people weren't seeing, and therefore the polls kind of also, and the commentaries kind of missed that boat. So it was a reckoning, and it shouldn't surprise us in the scheme of things. People really need something to change, and the question is, can he make it happen?
And looking back to 2015 when this whole campaign kind of got kicked off, everyone's been following, for that long. He was running his campaign like no other candidate has before. Is very loud, vocal, out there, not spending a lot of money. And have you seen something like that, or?
Well, there's no question it was downright vulgar. And of course, both sides engaged in probably one of the most shallow exchanges that we've seen in relatively modern history. But this is also nothing new for politics in the United States. I mean, you go back to the early 1800s and the formation of this country, and they were very nasty to one another. I mean, there's this famous example of Thomas Jefferson accusing John Adams of being a hermaphrodite to discredit his, character, and compare that to what we talk about today, and you can be your own judge. And of course, Jackson's wife was a slut, and so things were nasty, and they played those kinds of politics. I mean, a vice president killed a secretary of the Treasury, the famous Burr-Hamilton duel. So things were nasty, but I think we thought we moved forward from that sort of thing, and this was really kind of a much more shallow exchange in many respects.
And so he was officially elected. He won the majority electoral votes, but didn't win the popular vote. So a lot of people are talking now, should we abolish the Electoral College? Some people are trying to make a movement for that. And what do you think about something like that?
Well, first of all, it's almost inconceivable. It would require a constitutional amendment, which would be a laborious process. Plus, you'd eliminate 3/4 of the second article of the Constitution. The irony of this is how much emphasis we're putting on the presidency and the executive branch in the first place. Our founders never intended this. And one of the reasons they put the Electoral College in there is to try to temper not only the power of this person, but the way in which this person is ultimately elected. And I think the gap we're missing is that it's turned into a purely numerical formula instead of a deliberative formula, and it was originally intended to be about deliberation. And the Electoral College has not met yet, so it has not solidified the decision of the popular vote. Not that it's likely to change, because we've allowed this to become a mathematical formula rather than a deliberative one. Could some change occur? I think you're going to see a lot more pressure from states like Maine and Nebraska, who have proportional translation of the popular will into how the electoral votes in their state are distributed. There's probably going to be some push in that direction, but to what extent it will fundamentally change the way we engage presidential elections, probably not likely in our immediate lifetime. If it was going to happen, it would have happened back in 2000, I think.
Yeah, I was reading something. It was fascinating. It was that these electors that actually vote on the election, they could make a mistake where they spell someone's name wrong and it's counted as a vote, but in recent past, no one's ever gone against how the people voted or the electoral.
Well, there are instances, they're few and far between, and where someone does change their mind, it's one vote, so it's probably not going to change, even in this scenario, it wouldn't change the outcome of the election. But, this is also very interesting how the parties, which are nowhere defined in any of our founding documents, have an iron fist grip on the process. And they define these the electors are partisans who have been determined during the national conventions of each of the parties, and they're just following what is perceived to be the popular vote, the popular will, but it's a much more complicated story than that. Perhaps someday we can have a deeper discussion about that.
Definitely, and as the popular vote went, it ended up Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote, which was similar to what we saw in 2000, where the Democrat candidate won the popular but didn't win the electoral.
Of course, we break this down state by state so that you empower states, particularly the smaller states, to have what is perceived to be an equal share of influence in the Electoral College process. The problem that's not happening is that deliberative exercise is not engaged. And it used to be when the country was first created, we didn't even have the candidate's name on the ballot. You were electing the elector on the ballot. We still do that officially, but we show the candidate's name. And historically speaking, you were voting for the elector with the trust that they were going to be the type of person that could have a reasonable deliberation about how Michigan's votes would ultimately be cast. And they didn't all have to go in one direction either. Today it's winner take all, and the fact of the matter is, no one got a majority in any of these races, not a majority at all. These are all minority victories. And in France, for example, their presidential election requires a 51% majority. So we would have had to have a second election, a runoff between the top two vote getters. Well, that and if this were based on popular vote. But my point is that the Electoral College process, it appears to be based on majority, but it really isn't. It's a plurality.
And I think a fascinating point you brought up is people are putting so much emphasis on the presidential election when in reality the Republicans, who are obviously joyous after the election, they won the House, they won the Senate, so they have total control in Washington.
I think it's one of the most, the emphasis that we're placing on the presidency is one of the most tragic things of the contemporary American discourse. Put the parties aside, put this election aside. We are perpetually investing our energies and our attention into one person, regardless of who it was. And if it's your guy, you're excited. If it's not your guy, you're terrified. This is not healthy. This is not what our founders intended. And when you couple that with all of the social dynamics and the economic dynamics, we really have a reckoning to do to get our attention back to the first article of the Constitution, and that is Congress. You didn't hear a word about it in this entire election process.
No, it was all focused on the executive office.
It was really disturbing. As someone who's trying to watch this stuff from a more objective historical perspective and a structural perspective in terms of how the system was intended to function, we've drifted a long way. And the question is, will we drift even farther now, especially with one-party domination and with the type of persona that a Trump figure represents, although it probably wouldn't have been all that different with a Clinton presidency, because this is bipartisan, this consolidation of power. Unfortunately, we've allowed it to become kind of a zero-sum game dynamic as well, and we've got a lot of reckoning to do in this sense if we think we're really going to solve some of these problems and get everybody on a similar page.
All right, well, we're going to continue this conversation. We just have to take a quick break, so join us because there's more insights coming after the break. Welcome back to Insights. I'm joined by ACC Professor of Political Science, Tim Kuhnlein. And Tim, we were just talking about the executive office mainly, but let's move on to, Congress. The Senate and the House were both won by, or both have Republican majorities after the election. So tell me what that means when you have a political party having the three main branches right now in Washington.
Well, it's not the first time. In fact, if you look back at our most recent presidencies, there's usually a switch, usually midterm, in a president's four-year term. And we're probably going to see something similar to that. It's kind of interesting to go back and look at, okay, who's president, what was the composition of Congress in the first 2 years, then midterm elections, what happened, and what we find is there's a constant flip-flop. And so in terms of the partisan domination in Congress and in both chambers relative to the executive branch. And I suspect we'll see this this trend continue because it's part of that seesaw struggle that we're finding in the partisan divide, the zero-sum game tactics that are really not that dramatic, but we're making them very dramatic. And we're trying to winnow down formulas that work for most Americans, especially as most Americans are feeling like they're being left out of the success equation, the prosperity equation. So, and the Republicans, well, I should say the Trump campaign was very effective at speaking to that population.
And which is very interesting too, because this is a billionaire businessman who is speaking to people who are, lower class and middle class, working class people.
Yeah, but you can understand if you really listen, if you can get past this rhetoric and really look at some of the issues, especially in hindsight now, even though he did a lot of double talk and you really don't know what to think of what he's going to do, he was able to hone in on some strategic issues that I think spoke to that independent voter, the Reagan Democrat, the people who, over a third of our population who are claimed to be independents. Keeping in mind only 4% of our population are actually members of either of the political parties. So we're all independents in that sense. But he was able to pull a strategic percentage of that population in a razor-thin race to win this victory. And it had coattail effects, of course, the farther down the ballot you go.
Definitely, and that we saw those coattail effects here in Michigan as well, with many Republicans winning the state office in Lansing, and also we saw the first congressional district go to a Republican, to Jack Bergman. So, do you think he had a huge effect on Republicans winning most local elections?
Definitely, and it really played out not only in the 2-to-1 margins in places like the first congressional district, but and this is sort of a moderate, almost a Reagan Democrat type environment, really, because when you think about Bart Stupak having served as a moderate Democrat for 18 years, and then we shifted to Republican control of the seat, and now we've got a second phase of that. It's the question of can you reach that center ground, and in this case it was a 2-to-1 margin. But this is coattail effect for sure. It's also when you've got to look at the state, and it was those counties that voted Obama in the last 2 elections actually flipped to Trump this time. And those are counties where you get this sort of middle class, skilled labor that's being left out of the equation as the global economy continues to shape itself.
And I thought even the ones that were flipped to Trump this election, I thought even places like Wayne County, that's always huge Democratic, it's still that Hillary got a less percentage of those votes.
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, neither one of these candidates, for most people, were the most desirable candidates even within the party rank and file. So, but we got what we got, and then we had to make choices, and I think a lot of what explains this surprise and the switch factor in the election results is that a lot of people, I think, who traditionally would have voted chose not to vote as one way of protesting, or they went third party. But because voter turnout was actually the lowest in 25 years. So a lot of people who would have otherwise voted didn't vote as their form of protest, or they may just not have voted for president. And then people who haven't voted in years, my father, for example, since 1970 came out and voted. And it's people like him who had a dramatic impact one way or another on this election result in these counties, particularly in Michigan, that switched and gave us that razor-thin surprise. I mean, we're talking less than a tenth of a percent.
And I think that's a great point too, is like people felt two ways about this election. They were very against it, or they were very for it and very, wound up about for their person.
And for different reasons.
And for very different reasons.
They were voting in different trajectories and almost contradicting in some respects philosophically. But I think that demonstrates the frustration that people are facing, feeling right now, especially about the socioeconomics. So in any event.
All right, well, we're going to continue this conversation. We're just going to take a quick break, so stay tuned because there's more insights coming up. Welcome back to Insights. I'm Aaron Parsegian, and I'm joined by ACC Professor of Political Science, Tim Kuhnlein. And Tim, we were just talking about the Republican national domination, it seemed like, over all these offices in the House and Congress. What do you think that is going to result in?
Well, it doesn't stop at the national level. I mean, the Republican Party right now controls, although they lost seats in the Senate, so it's not like the trajectory necessarily went in their total direction, but clearly with the presidency and maintaining the Senate, which most people didn't think they were going to be able to do, they control the legislative and executive branches still. And then there's all the talk about how the court may change, although a replacement of Scalia isn't going to really change that dynamic. It's what comes after that in the next...
I think a lot of people are worried about maybe Ruth Bader Ginsburg's retirement and stuff like that.
Right. But it's not just the federal level. It's Republicans control the majority of governorships in the country in all 50 states, and also both chambers of the legislatures in most states. So this is unprecedented since the 1920s. And it's also interesting, there's a parallel because the discrepancies of wealth in our society are unprecedented except for the 1920s, 1929 actually. And our discrepancies actually exceed those of the 1920s now. So, there's a lot of talk about a plutocracy, that sort of thing, the rule by the moneyed elites, appeasing to or appealing to the lower classes, pulling them into the sway. But what's really going to be interesting about this is to see if the proof is in the pudding in a reasonable amount of time. And I think that we're ripe for it. We need something to give because the dynamic has become, quite frankly, frightening when you think about how this is playing out subconsciously in our fears and our anxieties and almost a paranoia. And then you add the political dynamic of all this, and that's just internally. What about the external threats that have a lot of people unsettled? So this is a really very critical period in our country's development. And I hope people are raising a consciousness that is cautious in the way that we move forward and we don't overstep. No one received a mandate. We need to find the middle ground that is workable and makes sense for a sustainable prosperity. And I want to believe that Trump will, with the right amount of guidance and pressure, whether it's internal or external, will help shape that. We have to believe that at this point.
And it was just obviously a wild campaign throughout the year. As a professor, what were you noticing in students? For the most part, I'm dealing with a population, half of whom can't vote yet, and the other half can. There was a sort of subdued quietness. It's almost a lethargy in a way. The millennials were not really excited. There was a little bit of talk, of course, that I heard from students about the Bernie campaign. Of course, there was a lot of Trump rah-rah, particularly when it was pretty clear that he was he got the nomination. I didn't see that so much prior to. Quite frankly, an obliviousness. We're not paying attention to this stuff for the most part. But my challenge is, of course, to raise consciousness and instill the importance of civics awareness and engagement.
And what we did is focus on the congressional elections. I shifted their attention from the popular appeal, and we tried to understand what was going on with Congress, particularly the Senate, where the real race was, in our congressional district. And I was very impressed at how students, I feel like they really got the message and became aware in a much more holistic sense than just a preoccupation with this presidential election.
And I think that's very important because we talked about how, you know, people only focus on the executive office, or at least the general public does. They don't understand what kind of, you know, consequences local offices and, you know, national offices like Congress have.
And I feel really good. Well, I think my students didn't really engage it initially. The end product was one, they met the challenge. And I think we're seeing this play out nationally. You know, it's the younger generations that are out there now, you know, engaging in these demonstrations. They're frustrated. Some of them are regretting that they didn't engage and vote. But they're also, they're concerned about where this is going on both sides of the aisle, if you will. So I'm reassured. And I think the whole outcome of this is probably that we've got a higher level of consciousness about our national politics than we've seen in a while.
And like we said, there was demonstrations. There was obviously some at University of Michigan, Michigan State, schools all around the nation. Have you seen this kind of like a backlash to an election to this extent?
Not that I can recall off the top of my head. This is one of my favorite questions to people that are older than myself is, you know, can you think of a scenario? You know, I grew up in the Reagan era, and so I don't think we've had anything quite like this, this close of a popular vote type scenario that translated into a contradiction. You know, the popular vote being different than the Electoral College vote has only happened 5 times in the history of our country, twice now in the 21st century. And one of those 5 is the Trump victory over Clinton. So, you know, in a reaction other than the war initiatives that we've been engaged in and the reaction to the war on terror and whatnot, I personally haven't seen anything quite like this.
Oh, well, it's going to be interesting to follow, Tim. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
And thanks for joining us. Join us back next week at the same time, same place for a new edition of Insights.
Insights into Northeast Michigan is produced by WBKB News. If you have any comments, suggestions, or topics you would like to see on a future show, please email WBKB News. This has been a production of Thunder Bay Broadcasting Corporation. All rights reserved.